Imagine a muddy field in Belgium in June 1815. Cannons are roaring, smoke fills the air, and tens of thousands of soldiers are dying. This is the Battle of Waterloo, the final confrontation that will decide the fate of Napoleon Bonaparte's empire. The outcome of this single day will reshape the map of Europe. While the soldiers fought on the ground, another battle was happening in the financial markets of London. This second battle would reshape the modern world in ways that are still felt today. At the center of this financial battle was Nathan Rothschild, a founding member of the now legendary banking dynasty. Rothschild had built something crucial in a time before telephones or the internet, a high-speed information network. He had trusted agents and fast boats ready to carry news across the English Channel faster than anyone else. Rothschild knew that the British government had borrowed massive amounts of money to fight Napoleon. This borrowing was done by selling government bonds. A bond is simply an IOU. You give the government cash today, and they promise to pay you back later with interest. If Napoleon won Waterloo, those British bonds would become worthless because the government might collapse. If Napoleon lost, the bonds would become incredibly valuable because the British government was secure. Rothschild's agents brought him the news of Napoleon's defeat a full day before the official government messengers arrived in London. Rothschild didn't immediately buy bonds. Instead, he did something cunning. He stood in the London Stock Exchange and started loudly selling his British bonds. Other traders saw the great banker selling and panicked. They assumed Rothschild knew Napoleon had won. Everyone started dumping their bonds, driving the price down to almost nothing. At the last possible moment, just before the official news of victory arrived, Rothschild secretly bought up almost the entire market for pennies on the dollar. When the truth came out that Britain had won, prices skyrocketed. In a single day, it is estimated Rothschild made a profit equivalent to roughly $600 billion in today's money. This story is often told to highlight Rothschild's cleverness or ruthlessness, but that misses the bigger point. This event was the blueprint for the modern financial system. The core thesis of our economic reality is this: wars are temporary events. The fighting eventually stops, but the debt used to pay for those wars is permanent. That debt does not just disappear when the peace treaties are signed. It sits on the national books, generating interest payments that must be met year after year, decade after decade. This mechanism, the creation of massive public debt to fund crises, has been the primary engine used to transfer wealth from the many to the few for the last 250 years. It is a system that, by its very design, eventually consumes the middle class. To understand how the middle class gets wiped out today, we have to understand how governments pay for war. When a war starts, a government needs an enormous amount of money immediately. They need to pay soldiers, build ships, manufacture guns, and buy supplies. They need gold and silver, or today, digital cash right now. Governments have two main ways to get money: taxes and borrowing. The problem with taxes is that they are slow. You have to pass laws, assess incomes, and collect the money over months or years. You cannot fight a sudden war using only current tax revenue. So governments must borrow. In the 1800s and the early 1900s, they borrowed from private banking houses. The bankers were more than happy to help. When a banker lends directly to a business, there is a risk the business will fail and the banker won't get paid back. But lending to a powerful government to fight a war is different. A government has the power to tax its entire population to pay back the loan. It is seen as a very safe bet. The bankers provide the immediate cash the government needs to fight. In exchange, the bankers receive government bonds. These bonds entitle the bankers to a stream of interest payments that can last for generations. History shows us how this war debt machine scales up. During the American Civil War, both the North and the South had to borrow heavily. The Union government sold hundreds of millions of dollars in bonds. The banks that bought them received steady interest payments long after the cannons stopped firing in 1865. The costs of the war were paid by taxpayers for decades afterward, enriching the bondholders who financed it. World War I saw this system expand to an industrial scale. The amounts of money needed for modern warfare were staggering. Britain and France ran out of money quickly. They turned to American banks, specifically the house of J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan became the official purchasing agent for Britain and France. They arranged over $3 billion in loans for the Allies. This created a situation of deep financial interdependence. The American banks had lent so much money to Britain and France that if Germany won the war, those banks might collapse. The lenders now had a direct financial stake in the outcome of the battlefield. The most shocking proof of the permanent debt thesis is Britain's World War I debt. The war ended in 1918. Britain continued making interest payments on some of those specific war bonds for nearly a century. The final payment on the debt, incurred to fight Emperor Kaiser Wilhelm II, was made in 2015, 97 years after the war ended. Generations of British taxpayers who were born long after the veterans had died were still paying for the artillery shells fired at the Somme. World War II changed everything again. The scale of the conflict was so massive that even the biggest private banks in the world didn't have enough money to lend to the governments. The costs were astronomical. Governments realized they couldn't rely solely on existing pools of private money. They needed a way to create money out of thin air to finance the war effort. This is where the central bank takes center stage. In the United States, this is the Federal Reserve, often called the Fed. Before this shift, if the government wanted to borrow $1 billion, it had to find private investors who had $1 billion in cash saved up to buy the bonds. Under the new system, the government could monetize the debt. Here is how it works in simple terms. The U.S. government needs $1 billion for warships. It doesn't have the money. The U.S. Treasury writes an IOU for $1 billion, a Treasury bond. The Federal Reserve takes that IOU. To pay for it, the Federal Reserve simply types $1 billion onto a computer screen. It creates new money that didn't exist 5 seconds ago. The government takes this newly created cash and spends it on the war. This system allowed the U.S. government to explode its debt levels to win World War II. Between 1940 and 1945, the U.S. national debt multiplied 6 times over. It was a necessary move to defeat fascism, but it embedded a new mechanism into the economy, the ability to fund government spending via the printing press. As world was ending in 1944, global leaders met at Bretton Woods in New Hampshire to design the post-war financial world. They agreed that the U.S. dollar would be the world's reserve currency. Every other country's currency would be pegged to the dollar, and the dollar would be pegged to gold, $35 per ounce. Crucially, this meant that the massive war debts around the world would effectively be denominated in dollars. This created a permanent global demand for American currency. It cemented the U.S. dollar's position as the king of finance, giving the U.S. an extraordinary privilege in how it managed its own debt. For a few decades after World War II, the system was relatively stable. The tie to gold acted as a restraint. The U.S. government couldn't just print an infinite amount of dollars because foreign governments could, in theory, trade those dollars in for actual gold from the U.S. reserves. Then came the Vietnam War and massive new social spending programs in the 1960s. The U.S. was spending far more than it brought in via taxes. To pay for it all, they printed more dollars. Other countries started to notice that America was printing way more paper dollars than it had gold in its vaults. France, in particular, started demanding gold in exchange for its surplus dollars. America's gold reserves began to drain away rapidly. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon made a historic announcement. To stop the gold drain, he said the United States would temporarily suspend the convertibility of the dollar into gold. That temporary move became permanent. This was the Nixon shock. It was the moment the dollar became a fiat currency. Fiat is Latin for let it be done. A fiat currency has value only because the government says it does, and we all agree to believe it. It is backed by nothing physical. This removed the final constraint on government borrowing and money printing. Now, we must confront a hard mathematical truth. The current U.S. national debt is over $36 trillion. The government cannot possibly pay this debt back through taxation alone. To do so would require taxing every American citizen at rates that would cause instant economic collapse and revolution. So if the debt cannot be repaid, what happens? The government uses inflation. Inflation is often described as prices going up. But that is looking at it backward. Inflation is actually your money losing value because there is too much of it in circulation. When the government prints trillions of new dollars to pay its bills, every existing dollar becomes worth a little bit less. It is a hidden tax. They don't take money out of your paycheck directly. They just make the money remaining in your paycheck buy fewer things. Historians of economics identify four distinct stages in the life and death of a currency. We can see these stages playing out right now. Stage 1. The trusted currency. This is when money is sound, often backed by gold or silver. Think of ancient Rome under Augustus or the US dollar under the early Bretton Woods Agreement. The currency holds its value over long periods. Stage 2. Debasement begins. The government faces a crisis, usually a war or political instability, and needs more money. They begin to reduce the precious metal content in coins, like Emperor Nero did, or break the link to gold entirely, like Nixon did. They start printing money to cover deficits. Stage 3, loss of control. This is where we are today. The debt becomes so large that the interest payments alone become one of the biggest expenses in the budget. The government has to print more money just to pay the interest on the money it already borrowed. It becomes a vicious cycle. Today, the U.S. government spends more on interest payments than it does on the entire national defense budget. Stage 4, the reset. Eventually, the mountain of debt and the flood of printed money destroy faith in the currency. The system buckles, and a new financial order must be established. How does this macroeconomic machinery affect a regular family living in the suburbs? This is where the theoretical meets the painful reality. We are currently living through a massive mathematical trap set by decades of debt financing. Consider what happened during the COVID-19 pandemic. The government needed to inject cash into the economy to prevent a depression. In less than 5 years, the U.S. banking system and the Federal Reserve created roughly $5.8 trillion in new money. To put that in perspective, that was roughly a 38% increase in the total supply of U.S. dollars in existence, all created in a very short window of time. When you increase the supply of money by nearly 40% without increasing the supply of goods and services by the same amount, prices must rise. This is what annihilates the middle class. We can divide society into winners and losers in an inflationary environment. The losers, wage earners and savers. The average middle-class person earns a paycheck and tries to save a little money in a bank account. The wage trap. Prices for food, energy, housing, and insurance rise instantly when new money floods the system. But wages rise very slowly. A worker might get a 3% raise, but if inflation is 8%, that worker has taken a 5% pay cut in real terms. Their standard of living drops even though their paycheck looks bigger on paper. The savings trap. Imagine a responsible couple who saved $200,000 over 20 years for retirement. That money is sitting in a bank. When inflation hits 20% over a few years, the purchasing power of that $200,000 drops dramatically. They didn't lose any actual dollars, but those dollars now buy significantly less of a retirement than they planned for. Their prudent behavior is punished. The winners, asset holders, and the government. The asset owners, the very wealthy generally don't keep their wealth in cash. They own assets, stocks, real estate, fine art, gold. When the money supply expands, that new money has to go somewhere. It usually flows into assets, pushing their prices up. The top 1% watches their stock portfolios and real estate holdings explode in value alongside inflation, often making them even richer in real terms while the middle class struggles to buy groceries. The government, this is the biggest winner of all. Inflation destroys the real value of debt. If the government owes $36 trillion and then causes 50% inflation over a decade, the real value of that debt burden has been cut in half. They get to pay back their bondholders with money that is worth much less than when they borrowed it. History provides grim warnings about where this leads if unchecked. The ultimate example is the Weimar Republic in Germany in 1923. Saddled with unpayable war debts after World War I, the government turned on the printing presses full blast. The result was hyperinflation. Prices didn't just rise, they doubled every few days. A loaf of bread that cost 250 marks in January cost 200 billion marks by November. People's entire life savings became worthless overnight. Middle-class lawyers and doctors were seen selling their heirloom furniture just to buy food for the week. The society collapsed, paving the way for political extremism. While the U.S. is not currently in Weimar-style hyperinflation, the underlying mechanic, printing money to cover unpayable debts, is exactly the same. We are now entering the critical phase of this long historical cycle. The numbers are becoming too large to ignore. The death spiral is no longer a theory. It is visible in the government's own budget data. In 2024, the U.S. government spent approximately $1.2 trillion just on interest payments for the national debt. That is more than was spent on the military. It is more than the amount spent on Medicare. The Congressional Budget Office projects that by 2034, just 10 years from now, mandatory spending will likely exceed all federal tax revenue. Mandatory spending includes Social Security, Medicare, and interest on the debt. This means that in a decade, every single penny collected in taxes by the U.S. government will be needed just to keep those three programs running. Every other function of government, the military, the FBI, national parks, highways, education departments, will have to be funded entirely by borrowing more money. This is the definition of a debt spiral. You must borrow more just to pay the interest on what you already borrowed. So, what is the path out? There are only three mathematically possible options for a government in this situation. 1. Cut spending. The government could drastically slash spending to balance the budget and start paying down debt. Politically, this is impossible. No party will survive cutting Social Security, Medicare, and the military simultaneously by the massive amounts required. 2. Default. The government could simply refuse to pay its bondholders. They could say, "Sorry, we can't pay you back." This would cause an instantaneous collapse of the global financial system, destroying banks and pension funds worldwide. No world leader wants to be responsible for that. 3. Inflate. This is the only politically viable option. The government will continue to work with the central bank to print money to cover the shortfalls. They will attempt to keep inflation running hot, perhaps 4%, 6%, or 8% a year for a decade or more. The goal is to melt away the real value of the debt burden. By causing persistent inflation, the $36 trillion debt looks smaller in comparison to the inflated GDP of the future. Some economic projections suggest we might need to see the equivalent of $90 trillion in new inflation over the next 15 years to make the current debt load manageable. That is $90 trillion worth of purchasing power stolen, primarily from wage earners and savers. The story that began with Nathan Rothschild at Waterloo and continued through the world wars to the modern Federal Reserve is culminating right now. The national debt is not an abstract number that only economists need to worry about. It is a direct claim on your future labor and the future labor of your children. It is vital to understand the rules of the game being played. The system is designed to transfer wealth from holders of currency to holders of debt and assets. If you rely solely on a salary and keep your savings in a standard bank account, you are the target of this financial repression. You are the fuel that keeps the debt machine running. Surviving this period requires a shift in mindset. The traditional middle-class path, work hard, save cash, retire, is broken because the money itself is broken. The only defense is to shift from holding currency to holding assets. This means owning things that have intrinsic value outside of government promises: real estate, profitable businesses, stocks, precious metals, or other tangible resources. These are things that tend to rise in price along with inflation, preserving purchasing power while cash dissolves. The famous economist Ludwig von Mises once warned that there is no way to avoid the final collapse of a boom brought about by credit expansion. The only question is whether the crisis arrives sooner as a result of voluntary abandonment of further credit expansion, or later as a final and total catastrophe of the currency system. Governments throughout history facing unpayable debts incurred from war and crisis almost always choose the latter. They choose inflation. As an old financial adage goes, unpayable government debt never gets paid. It gets inflated away, and the middle class is the sacrifice that pays for it.